The gangster realized his consigliere stole all the money, but the money was fake. The amber whiskey caught the dim light filtering through the grimy windows of Torino's speakeasy, casting golden shadows across Vincent's weathered face. Ice clinked against glass as he set down his drink, the sound sharp in the silence that had fallen over the back room. The ledger lay open before him, its pages telling a story that made his blood run cold. $60,000, Vincent murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Gone. Chicago's October wind howled through the alley behind the establishment, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of rain and something darker, the smell of betrayal that seemed to permeate the very walls of the South Side. Vincent Torino had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way up from the tenements of Little Italy through sheer will and calculated violence. At 38, he commanded respect from the docks to the Loop, his name spoken in hushed tones by those who valued their lives. But now, staring at the empty columns where his fortune should have been recorded, he felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a child, dodging his father's drunken fists. Vulnerability. The door creaked open, and Tommy Marconi stepped inside, his usually impeccable suit wrinkled and his face pale. Tommy had been Vincent's eyes and ears on the street for the better part of a decade, a wiry man with quick hands and quicker wits who could smell trouble 3 blocks away. "Boss, we got a problem," Tommy said, removing his fedora and running nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "Marco ain't been seen for 2 days. His apartment's cleaned out, and Mrs. Benedetti says he told her he was going to visit his sister in New York." Vincent's jaw tightened. Marco Benedetti, his consigliere, his most trusted advisor, the man who had stood beside him through the bloodiest gang wars Chicago had ever seen. They had grown up together in the same cramped tenement building, sharing stale bread and impossible dreams. When Vincent had needed someone to manage the family's finances, someone he could trust with his life, Marco had been the natural choice. "When was the last time anyone saw him?" Vincent asked, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. 3 nights ago, at Capelli's. He was drinking heavy, talking about how a man's got to look out for himself in this world. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "Joey Russo," said. Marco kept checking his watch, like he was waiting for something. Vincent stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands scarred from years of street fighting, he cut an imposing figure even in the dim light. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his brown eyes held a cold intensity that had made grown men weep. "Get me everything," he said quietly. "Will you bank records, train schedules, every conversation Marco had in the past month. I want to know what he ate for breakfast and who he talked to while he was chewing it." Tommy nodded and turned to leave, but Vincent's voice stopped him at the door. "And Tommy, bring me Salvatore Nitti. If anyone knows what Marco was planning, it's that rat-faced bookkeeper." After Tommy left, Vincent returned to his chair and poured another whiskey. The speakeasy hummed with muted activity beyond the door, the clink of glasses, low laughter, the soft shuffling of cards. It was the sound of his empire, built on bootleg liquor and protected by fear and loyalty, or so he had thought. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could have. Marco wasn't just his consigliere, he was the brother Vincent had never had, the one person in this brutal world who had understood the weight of command, the loneliness that came with power. They had made a pact as boys, swearing on their mothers' graves that they would always watch each other's backs, that no woman, no money, no temptation would ever come between them. Vincent opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a worn photograph. 2 young men stood side by side outside Benedetti's bakery, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Marco's father had taken the picture the day they had made their first score, robbing a numbers runner who had been skimming from the Irish gangs. They had been 18, invincible, ready to take on the world. Now, 20 years later, one of them was a thief, and the other was planning his murder. The whiskey burned as Vincent drained his glass. Outside, Chicago's lights twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing someone's dreams, someone's struggles, someone's betrayals. In this city, loyalty was a luxury few could afford, and Vincent had been a fool to believe that blood and brotherhood could survive in a world built on greed and violence. But he would find Marco Benedetti, and when he did, His old friend would learn that some betrayals carried a price that could only be paid in blood. The morning sun cast long shadows across Michigan Avenue as Vincent's black Cadillac prowled through Chicago's awakening streets. Behind the wheel, Tommy navigated the early traffic with practiced ease, while Vincent sat in the back seat, his mind calculating angles and possibilities like a chess master planning his endgame. Salvatore Nitti's apartment building stood in a part of town where honest people kept their curtains drawn and their mouths shut. The three-story brick structure had seen better decades, its facade stained with soot from the nearby rail yards, and its windows clouded with years of neglect. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to, which made it perfect for the kind of work Sal did. Vincent climbed the narrow staircase, his expensive leather shoes clicking against worn wooden steps. The building smelled of cabbage, cigarettes, and broken dreams. On the second floor, a baby cried behind thin walls while someone played a scratchy phonograph record. It was the Symphony of Urban Poverty, a song Vincent knew by heart. Sal's door was unmarked, but Vincent had no trouble finding apartment 2B. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, the signal that identified him to those in his employ. The door opened to reveal a small, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Salvatore Nitti looked like what he was, a numbers man who preferred the company of ledgers to people, a man who found comfort in the predictability of mathematics in a world governed by chaos. "Mr. Torino," Sal stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting. We need to talk, Sal." Vincent stepped past him into the cramped apartment. The living space was spartanly furnished but impeccably organized. Ledgers lined wooden shelves, their spines labeled with meticulous care. A desk sat near the single window, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers and a mechanical calculator. This was where Sal performed his alchemy, transforming the raw violence of Vincent's business into clean columns of profit and loss. "It's about Marco," Vincent said, settling into the room's only comfortable chair. Sal's face went pale behind his spectacles. "I don't know nothing about Mr. Benedetti's business. I just keep the books you give me to keep." Vincent studied the smaller man's face, reading the micro-expressions that betrayed fear, guilt, and something else. "Relief, Sal. We've worked together for 5 years. In all that time, have I ever hurt someone who was straight with me? No, sir. Then be straight with me now. What do you know about the money Marco stole?" Sal removed his glasses and cleaned them with shaking hands, a nervous habit Vincent had observed countless times during their business meetings. "Mr. Torino, I think there might be something wrong with some of the cash that's been coming in." "What kind of wrong?" "The bills, sir. Some of them don't feel right. The paper's too smooth. And the printing." Sal trailed off, as if afraid to voice his suspicions. Vincent leaned forward. "Show me." With obvious reluctance, Sal moved to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. He withdrew a stack of 20s bound with a rubber band and handed them to Vincent. "These came in last week from the Riverside operation. Mr. Benedetti brought them personally." Vincent examined the bills, running his thumb across their surface. To the untrained eye, they looked authentic. The right color, the correct dimensions, even the proper feel of currency. But as he studied them more closely, he noticed subtle irregularities. The ink seemed slightly too vibrant, and the paper, as Sal had noted, lacked the distinctive texture of genuine treasury paper. "How much of our money is like this?" Vincent asked. "I can't be sure, but maybe 20–30% of what's come through in the past 2 months. Vincent's mind raced. If Sal was right, then Marco hadn't just stolen from him. He had been systematically replacing real money with counterfeit bills. But why? And more importantly, where had the fake money come from? "Sal, I need you to go through every transaction from the past 3 months. I want to know exactly when this funny money started showing up and which operations it came from." "Yes, sir. Should take me maybe 2 days to—" "You have 6 hours." Vincent's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "And Sal? Not a word about this to anyone. As far as the world knows, this conversation never happened." Vincent left Sal's apartment with more questions than answers. The counterfeit money complicated everything. If Marco had been stealing, it was one kind of betrayal, personal but understandable in their world where every man was ultimately looking out for himself. But if he had been replacing real money with fakes, that suggested a different kind of game entirely. The Cadillac's engine purred as Tommy navigated toward the warehouse district. Vincent had built his reputation on his ability to see 3 moves ahead of his enemies, to anticipate their strategies and counter them before they even knew they were in a fight. But this situation felt different. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. "Where to next, boss?" Tommy asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "The docks. I want to talk to Mickey O'Brien." Mickey ran the longshoremen's union for the Irish gangs, but he also maintained carefully negotiated neutrality with Vincent's organization. If anyone would know about counterfeit money moving through Chicago's underworld, it would be Mickey. The man had his finger on the pulse of every illegal enterprise in the city. As they drove through the industrial landscape of Chicago's South Side, Vincent considered the implications of what Sal had shown him. Counterfeiting was serious business, the kind that brought federal attention, the kind that could destroy not just a man but an entire organization. If Marco had gotten involved with funny money, he had put them all at risk. But there was something else bothering Vincent, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. Marco had been acting strangely for weeks, distracted, nervous, making excuses to avoid their usual Sunday dinners with their extended family. At the time, Vincent had attributed it to stress from their ongoing territorial disputes with the North Side gangs. Now he wondered if Marco had been trying to tell him something, trying to warn him about a threat he couldn't quite articulate. The thought that his oldest friend might have been protecting him, even while appearing to betray him, was almost too painful to contemplate. Almost. The pier stretched into Lake Michigan like a weathered finger pointing toward an uncertain horizon. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries mixing with the groan of cargo cranes and the distant whistle of incoming trains. The scent of fish and industrial oil hung heavy in the October air, while dock workers moved with practiced efficiency among towering stacks of crates and coiled rope. Mickey O'Brien sat on a wooden crate, his massive frame making the makeshift seat seem childlike. At 55, Mickey had the look of a man who had spent decades hauling cargo and settling disputes with his fists. His red hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face bore the map of 1,000 bar fights, but his blue eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of Chicago's most effective power brokers. "Vincent Torino," Mickey said in his thick Irish brogue, not bothering to stand. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Vincent approached slowly, his hands visible and relaxed. The docks were neutral territory, governed by an unspoken code that had prevented all-out war between the city's various factions. Here, even sworn enemies could conduct business without fear of sudden violence. "Need some information, Mickey. Figured you might be able to help." Mickey gestured to another crate, and Vincent sat down, grateful for the opportunity to talk as equals rather than adversaries. Around them, longshoremen continued their work, but Vincent noticed how they gave the 2 men a respectful distance. "What kind of information?" "The kind that involves funny money moving through the city." Mickey's expression didn't change, but Vincent caught the slight tensing around his eyes that indicated sudden alertness. In their business, the ability to read such micro-expressions often meant the difference between life and death. "That's federal business, Vincent. The kind of business that brings unwanted attention to everyone." "I know, but someone's been passing bad bills through my operations, and I need to know who." Mickey pulled out a flask and took a long drink before offering it to Vincent. The whiskey was harsh and warming, the kind of rotgut that could strip paint but somehow tasted like honesty in a world full of lies. "There's been talk," Mickey said finally. "Rumors about a new player in town, someone with connections to the Treasury Department. Word is they've been setting up local operators, using them to distribute counterfeit currency while keeping their own hands clean." Vincent felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lake breeze. "Any names?" "Nothing solid. But the word on the street is that this operation is big, bigger than anything Chicago's seen before. They're not just printing 20s and 50s. We're talking about a full-scale counterfeiting ring with government-quality plates and paper." "Government quality?" Mickey nodded grimly. "The kind that requires inside help. The kind that suggests someone with serious connections is pulling the strings." Vincent's mind raced through the implications. If Mickey was right, then Marco hadn't been stealing from him at all. He had been the victim of an elaborate setup, just as Vincent had been. But that raised even more disturbing questions about who was behind the operation and why they had targeted his organization. Mickey. If someone wanted to destroy my operation using funny money, how would they do it? The Irishman considered the question carefully. First, they'd need to get the counterfeit bills into your cash flow without you knowing. That means they'd need someone on the inside, someone you trusted completely, like a consigliere. Aye. Then once enough funny money was in circulation, they'd tip off the feds. When the Treasury agents came calling, they'd find your organization in possession of thousands of dollars in counterfeit currency. Even if you could prove you didn't know it was fake, the legal troubles alone would destroy your business. Vincent felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Marco's strange behavior, the systematic replacement of real money with fakes, his sudden disappearance, it all suggested that his oldest friend had discovered the deception and fled rather than face Vincent's inevitable wrath. There's something else, Mickey continued. The timing of all this funny money showing up, it coincides with some new federal task force that's been formed to combat organized crime, led by some hotshot prosecutor from Washington. You think this is connected? I think nothing happens by accident in our business, Vincent. Someone's playing a very sophisticated game, and they're using all of us as pawns. Vincent stood and shook Mickey's hand, a gesture of respect and gratitude that carried weight in their world. I owe you one, to a Mickey. Just remember our conversation when the time comes to choose sides. The drive back to the speakeasy gave Vincent time to think. If his suspicions were correct, then Marco hadn't betrayed him. He had been manipulated into a position where he appeared to be a traitor. The real question was whether Marco had realized what was happening before it was too late. Back at the speakeasy, Vincent found Tommy waiting with a stack of papers and a grim expression. Boss, Sal finished his analysis. You're gonna want to see this. The numbers told a stark story. Over the past 2 months, nearly $40,000 in counterfeit currency had flowed through Vincent's operations, all of it traced back to specific sources that Marco had been handling personally. The pattern was too clean, too precise to be accidental. It's like someone was painting a target on us, Tommy observed. Vincent nodded, studying the meticulous records that Sal had prepared. Each entry told part of a larger story: payments from the Riverside Numbers operation, collections from the South Side speakeasies, proceeds from their trucking business, all of it contaminated with funny money that would have eventually brought federal investigators to their door. Tommy, I want you to find Marco. But when you do, don't hurt him. I think our boy got himself into something bigger than he could handle. You think he's innocent? Vincent looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, its towers reaching toward a sky that promised rain. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Marco Benedetti was hiding, probably terrified and certainly alone. Whether he was guilty or innocent, he was still the closest thing to a brother that Vincent had ever had. I think he's in trouble. And if I'm right about who's behind this, we all are. The telephone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the afternoon quiet. Vincent answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral. Torino. Vincent. The voice was barely recognizable, strained and frightened. It's Marco, we need to talk. The abandoned warehouse stood like a monument to Chicago's industrial past, its broken windows staring blindly out at the railroad yards beyond. Built during the city's great expansion following the fire of 1871, it had once housed thousands of tons of grain and lumber. Now it served as a cathedral of rust and decay, its vast interior echoing with memories of better times. Vincent arrived alone, as Marco had insisted. The late afternoon sun slanted through holes in the roof, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance with each passing cloud. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as he made his way toward the center of the building, where a small circle of light marked their designated meeting place. Marco emerged from the shadows, like a ghost returning to the world of the living. Vincent barely recognized his oldest friend. The usually immaculate Consigliere now looked like a man who had been running for his life. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his hair unkempt, his face bearing the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept in days. But it was his eyes that shocked Vincent the most. They held a desperation that he had never seen before, not even during the bloodiest days of their rise to power. Marco, Vincent said quietly, stopping 10 feet away from his friend. Despite everything, Despite the stolen money and the betrayal, he felt a surge of relief at seeing Marco alive. "Thank Christ you came alone." Marco's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Vincent, I know what you must think, but I swear on my mother's grave, I never meant for any of this to happen." "Then why don't you tell me what did happen?" Marco laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the empty space. "You remember Tommy Agnello? Used to run books for the Jennas before they got wiped out." Vincent nodded. Tommy Agnello had been a small-time operator, the kind of man who survived by being useful to more powerful players without ever becoming a threat himself. 3 months ago, Tommy came to me with a proposition. Said he had a source for high-quality counterfeit bills, treasury quality, he called them, the kind that could pass any inspection. He wanted to use our operations to distribute them, promised us a 40% cut of everything that moved. And you believed him? I told him no. Marco's voice carried the weight of exhaustion and regret, but he kept coming back, kept pushing. Said if we didn't take the deal, he'd go to the North Side gangs, and then we'd be competing against funny money while trying to run legitimate operations. Vincent studied his friend's face, reading the pain and confusion there. "So what changed your mind?" He showed me federal documents, Vincent, real ones. Treasury Department memos about a new task force targeting organized crime in Chicago. Our names were on those lists, along with detailed information about our operations. Tommy said the feds were closing in, that we needed alternative sources of income to survive what was coming. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture, and Vincent didn't like what he was seeing. "Let me guess. Tommy offered to help you move legitimate money out of the country, while replacing it with counterfeit bills to throw the feds off the scent." Marco nodded miserably. "He said if the Treasury agents found funny money in our operations, but couldn't prove we knew it was counterfeit, it would create enough legal confusion to buy us time to relocate our real assets. And you believed that pile of horse shit?" I didn't know what to believe. Marco's voice cracked with emotion. "Vincent, you don't understand what it's been like these past months. Every time a car backfired, I thought it was gunshots. Every knock on the door could have been federal agents. I was trying to protect us, trying to find a way to save what we'd built." Vincent felt his anger beginning to cool, replaced by a growing understanding of how thoroughly his friend had been manipulated. Marco wasn't a thief, he was a victim, caught in an elaborate web designed to destroy them both. "Where's the real money now?" Vincent asked. Tommy said he was moving it to secure accounts in Montreal. "But Vincent," Marco's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "I tried to contact him yesterday. His phone's been disconnected, and his apartment's empty. I think he's gone." Vincent walked to one of the broken windows and stared out at the rail yards, where freight trains moved like mechanical serpents between rows of cargo containers. The scope of the deception was becoming clear now. Someone had used Marco's fears and loyalty to manipulate him into a situation that would destroy both of them. Marco, the counterfeit money. Where did Tommy say it came from? He claimed he had connections inside the Treasury Department itself. So there was a group of agents who were running their own operation, using seized counterfeiting equipment to fund off-the-books investigations. That was the missing piece Vincent had been searching for. If federal agents were indeed behind the counterfeiting operation, it explained the high quality of the fake bills and the sophisticated nature of the scheme. But it also meant they were dealing with enemies who had resources and authority far beyond anything Chicago's traditional crime families could muster. "Vincent," Marco said, his voice filled with desperation, "what are we going to do? If the feds find that funny money in our accounts, they already know about it," Vincent interrupted. "This whole thing was designed to give them justification for a massive raid on our operations. Tommy Agnello was never working for himself. He was working for them." The two men stood in silence, the weight of their situation settling over them like a funeral shroud. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting the warehouse in deeper shadows. Soon, darkness would fall over Chicago, and with it would come the reckoning they both knew was inevitable. "We need to disappear," Marco said finally. "Take whatever clean money we have left and get out of the country while we still can." Vincent considered his friend's words. It would be the smart play. Cut their losses and run, start over somewhere else with new identities and a chance at a clean life. But the idea of abandoning everything they had built, of letting their enemies win so completely, stuck in his throat like poison. "There's another option," Vincent said slowly. "We find Tommy Agnello and make him tell us exactly who he was working for and where our real money went. Then we expose this whole operation and take our chances with the law." Marco shook his head. "Vincent, you're talking about going to war with federal agents. That's not a fight we can win. Maybe not, but it's better than running like thieves in the night." Vincent turned from the window to face his oldest friend, seeing in Marco's frightened features the boy who had once sworn to stand by him no matter what came. They had been through gang wars and police raids, betrayals and triumphs, always watching each other's backs against a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Now they faced their greatest challenge yet, not from rival gangs or corrupt cops, but from the very system they had spent their lives opposing. And as Vincent looked into Marco's eyes, he saw the same resolve that had carried them through every previous crisis. "So what's it going to be, Marco? Do we run or do we fight?" Marco straightened his shoulders and smoothed down his wrinkled suit, some of his old dignity returning. "We fight, Vincent, like we always have." Vincent smiled for the first time in days. "Then let's go find ourselves a federal rat." The Blackstone Hotel rose 12 stories above South Michigan Avenue, its limestone facade a testament to Chicago's architectural ambitions. In the elegant lobby, beneath crystal chandeliers and marble columns, the city's elite conducted their business with the kind of refined discretion that money could buy. It was the perfect place for a federal agent to hide in plain sight. Vincent and Marco sat in leather chairs near the lobby's massive windows, their attention focused on the morning edition of the Chicago Tribune. To any observer, they appeared to be two successful businessmen discussing the day's financial news. In reality, they were hunters preparing to confront their prey. "Room 847, Tommy whispered, leaning forward to light Vincent's cigarette. "Tommy Agnello's been registered under the name Thomas Allen for the past week, paid in advance with Treasury Department vouchers." Vincent's jaw tightened. The confirmation that Tommy was indeed a federal agent removed any lingering doubt about the scope of the conspiracy they faced. This wasn't simply a case of counterfeiting. It was an elaborate sting operation designed to destroy Chicago's most powerful crime families. Security. Two men posted in the hallway, probably more inside the room. "They're not taking any chances." Marco shifted nervously in his chair. Despite his resolve from the previous evening, the reality of confronting federal agents in broad daylight was testing his courage. "Vincent, maybe we should reconsider. If we get caught in that room, we won't get caught," Vincent said quietly. "Because we're not going to do anything illegal. We're simply going to have a conversation with an old friend." At precisely 11 o'clock, Vincent and Marco made their way to the elevator. The brass doors slid shut with a whisper, carrying them upward toward what might be their final confrontation. Vincent's mind was calm, focused on the task ahead. He had faced death before, had stared down the barrels of rival gangsters' guns, and felt the cold breath of mortality on his neck. But this felt different, more consequential, as if the entire course of his life hung in the balance. The 8th-floor hallway was elegantly appointed, with thick carpeting that muffled their footsteps and oil paintings depicting scenes of Chicago's founding. Two men in cheap suits stood near room 847, their bulky frames and suspicious eyes marking them as clearly as if they wore badges on their lapels. Vincent approached them with the confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to be. "Gentlemen, I'm Vincent Torino. I believe Tommy's expecting me." The larger of the two agents stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward the bulge beneath his jacket. "I'm going to need you to turn around and walk back to the elevator, Mr. Torino." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Vincent replied pleasantly. "You see, Tommy has something that belongs to me, and I've come to collect it." Before the agent could respond, the door to room 847 opened, revealing a thin man in an expensive suit. Tommy Agnello looked older than Vincent remembered, his dark hair receding, and his face bearing the lines of someone who had spent years living under assumed identities. But his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him useful to so many different masters. "It's all right, boys," Tommy said to the guards. "Let them in. We've been expecting this conversation for quite some time." The hotel room was spacious and elegantly furnished, with a sitting area that offered stunning views of Lake Michigan. Tommy gestured for Vincent and Marco to take seats on the sofa, while he settled into an armchair facing them. The two federal agents positioned themselves near the door, their hands never straying far from their weapons. "I have to admit, Vincent, you're even more resourceful than our files indicated," Tommy said, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. "Finding me here took considerable skill. Finding you was the easy part, Tommy. Understanding why you destroyed my operation, that's what I'm here to learn." Tommy smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "Your operation was doomed from the moment you decided to prey on honest people, Vincent. All we did was accelerate the inevitable." Vincent studied the federal agent's face, reading the mixture of professional satisfaction and personal contempt there. So this was all about justice? About bringing down the big, bad gangsters? This was about stopping a criminal empire that had corrupted every level of Chicago's government, Tommy replied. "Do you have any idea how many people have suffered because of your organization? How many honest businesses you've destroyed? How many lives you've ruined?" Marco leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "And what about the lives you've ruined with your funny money scheme? What about the innocent people who got caught up in your deception?" Tommy's expression hardened. "Sometimes the greater good requires difficult sacrifices. Your friend here understood that, even if he didn't realize it at the time." Vincent felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You needed Marco to believe he was helping me, didn't you? You needed him to feel like he was protecting our organization, not destroying it. Marco's loyalty to you was legendary, Vincent. There was no way he would have cooperated if he thought he was betraying you. So we created a scenario where his loyalty became the very weapon we used against you both." The elegant cruelty of the scheme was breathtaking in its scope. Tommy and his federal colleagues had manipulated Marco's deepest fears and strongest virtues, turning his love for Vincent into an instrument of their mutual destruction. "Where's our real money?" Vincent asked. Tommy reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "Blue seized as evidence of racketeering and tax evasion. Every dollar you ever stole from honest citizens is now in federal custody, where it belongs." Vincent opened the envelope and found a series of legal documents detailing the seizure of bank accounts, safe deposit boxes, and other assets totaling nearly $200,000. It was everything they had worked for, accumulated over years of careful planning and calculated risks. "However," Tommy continued, "there is a way for both of you to avoid lengthy prison sentences." Vincent and Marco exchanged glances. They had been expecting this moment, the offer that would transform them from targets into assets, from criminals into informants. "We want detailed information about every major criminal organization in Chicago," Tommy said. "Names, operations, financial records, everything. In exchange, you'll receive new identities and relocation assistance." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Michigan Avenue. Vincent stared out the window at the city he had called home for his entire life, the streets where he had built his reputation and his fortune. The federal agent's offer represented survival, but it also meant abandoning everything that had ever mattered to him. "And if we refuse?" Marco asked quietly. Tommy's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Then you'll both be arrested within the hour on charges of counterfeiting, racketeering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. With the evidence we have, you'll be looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Vincent stood and walked to the window, his mind weighing options and calculating odds. Behind him, he could feel the tension radiating from Marco, the desperate hope that somehow they could find a way out of the trap that had closed around them. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on him. They had spent their lives taking calculated risks, always believing they could stay one step ahead of the law. Now they faced the ultimate calculation, their freedom in exchange for betraying everyone who had ever trusted them. "So I need some time to think about it," Vincent said finally. Tommy checked his watch. "You have until 6 o'clock this evening. After that, the offer expires." Vincent and Marco left the hotel in silence, walking through the loop as the midday sun cast sharp shadows between the towering buildings. Around them, Chicago pulsed with its usual energy. Businessmen hurrying to lunch meetings, shoppers examining window displays, children playing in small parks. It was the city they had always known, yet somehow it felt foreign now, as if they were seeing it through the eyes of strangers. "What are we going to do?" Marco asked as they reached Grant Park. Vincent sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching sailboats move across the blue water like white ghosts. For the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely uncertain about the future. Every choice seemed to lead to a different kind of destruction. "I don't know, Marco. I honestly don't know." But even as he spoke the words, Vincent's mind was already working on a third option, one that Tommy Agnello and his federal colleagues hadn't anticipated. It would require everything he had learned about survival and strategy, and it would demand sacrifices that would change both men forever. "Marco," Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of final decision. "Do you still have contacts in the newspaper business?" Marco looked confused. "Sure, a few guys at the Tribune and the Herald." "Why?" Vincent stood and straightened his coat, his posture once again radiating the quiet confidence that had made him Chicago's most feared crime boss. "Because we're going to give Tommy Agnello exactly what he deserves." The plan that formed in Vincent's mind was audacious in its simplicity. If the federal agents thought they could manipulate the truth to destroy innocent people, then they would learn what real manipulation looked like. By 6 o'clock that evening, Chicago would know the true story of the counterfeiting scheme, not from the perspective of law enforcement, but from the men who had been its victims. As they walked back toward the heart of the city, Vincent felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the thrill of betting everything on a single throw of the dice. Win or lose, he and Marco would face their fate on their own terms, with their honor intact and their friendship unbroken. The last deception would be theirs to right. 3 hours later, Vincent Torino and Marco Benedetti walked into the offices of the Chicago Tribune, carrying with them evidence that would expose one of the most sophisticated federal sting operations in American history. They had chosen truth over survival, honor over safety. The headline stretched across the entire front page of the Chicago Tribune in bold, black letters. "Federal agents frame Chicago businessmen with counterfeit currency." Below it, a smaller subheading read, "Treasury Department denies involvement in elaborate sting operation." Vincent sat in the back booth of Murphy's Diner, 3 blocks from where his speakeasy had once operated, reading the morning edition with something approaching satisfaction. The story had run exactly as he and Marco had hoped, complete with photocopies of the federal documents Tommy had shown Marco, bank records proving the systematic replacement of genuine currency, and testimony from Salvatore Nitti about the counterfeit bills. Suspicious quality. The reporter, Patrick Sullivan, had been skeptical at first, but when Vincent produced Tommy's federal vouchers for the Blackstone Hotel, and Marco provided detailed accounts of his meetings with the supposed Treasury insider, Sullivan's journalistic instincts took over. The story was too big, too detailed, and too well documented to ignore. "You see this?" Marco asked, sliding into the booth opposite Vincent. He carried the morning editions of 3 other papers. The Herald, the Sun, and even the New York Times had picked up the story. "It's everywhere," Vincent nodded, though he felt none of the triumph he might have expected. The truth was out, but the cost of exposing it was still being calculated. "Any word from our people?" Mixed reactions. "Some of the boys think we're heroes for exposing federal corruption. Others," Marco's voice trailed off, "others think we crossed a line by going to the press instead of handling it in-house." The diner's bell chimed as the door opened, and Vincent's hand instinctively moved toward the gun beneath his jacket. But it was only Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly Polish woman who cleaned the offices upstairs. She nodded at them politely and took a seat at the counter, apparently unaware that she was sharing breakfast with 2 of Chicago's most wanted men. "The feds are claiming it's all lies," Marco continued, spreading the Herald open on the table. "Treasury Department issued a statement calling us desperate criminals attempting to discredit legitimate law enforcement." Vincent had expected as much. The federal government couldn't afford to admit that its agents had engaged in the kind of deception that would make even Chicago gangsters blush. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and doubt was often more powerful than proof in the court of public opinion. "What about Tommy?" Marco smiled grimly. "That's the interesting part. According to the Tribune's sources, Agent Thomas Agnello has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Seems the Treasury Department is taking a very close look at his recent activities." The coffee was bitter, but Vincent drank it anyway, savoring the simple pleasure of a morning routine that might be his last as a free man. Through the diner's windows, he could see Chicago waking up, delivery trucks rumbling through the streets, shopkeepers raising their awnings, children walking to school with book bags slung over their shoulders. It was the same city he had known all his life, yet everything had changed. "Vincent," Marco said quietly, "we need to talk about what happens next." Vincent looked up from his paper. "You mean besides the federal indictments that are probably being prepared as we speak?" "I mean the future, our future." Marco reached into his coat and withdrew a train ticket. "Montreal. Leaves this afternoon. I've got contacts there, people who can help us start over." Vincent studied the ticket, noting the single name printed on it. "Just one ticket. I figured you might want to go somewhere else. California, maybe, or down to Mexico. We don't have to stick together if it makes things too dangerous." For a moment, Vincent considered the offer. It would be easier to disappear alone, to shed his identity like an old coat and emerge somewhere else as a completely different man. But as he looked across the table at Marco, his oldest friend, his brother in all but blood, he knew he couldn't do it. "We started this together, Marco. We'll finish it together." Marco's relief was visible. "So Montreal?" "Montreal." Vincent pulled out his wallet and left money on the table for their coffee. As they stood to leave, he caught sight of their reflection in the diner's mirror. Two middle-aged men in expensive suits, their faces bearing the lines of hard decisions and harder years. They looked like what they were, survivors in a world that didn't forgive weakness or reward loyalty. But they had survived, and they had done it without betraying each other or the principles that had guided them through 2 decades of violence and moral ambiguity. The money was gone, their empire was destroyed, and their future was uncertain. But they still had each other, and in their world, that was worth more than all the counterfeit currency in Chicago. Outside, the November air was crisp and clean, carrying with it the scent of snow and new beginnings. Vincent and Marco walked south toward Union Station, 2 figures disappearing into the crowd of honest citizens going about their daily business. Behind them, in the abandoned warehouse where they had met the night before, Vincent had left something for the federal agents who would inevitably come looking for them. Taped to the wall was the old photograph of him and Marco outside Benedetti's bakery, the one that had once represented their dreams of power and wealth. Scrawled across the bottom in Vincent's neat handwriting was a simple message. The money was fake, but the friendship was real. V. Dewey? By noon, Vincent Torino and Marco Benedetti were on a train heading north, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge that they had faced their greatest test and emerged with their integrity intact. Whether they would build new lives in Montreal or simply fade into obscurity, they would do it together. The last deception had been theirs to write, and they had written it well. In the months that followed, the Treasury Department's internal investigation would quietly confirm most of the allegations made in the Tribune story. Agent Thomas Agnello would be dismissed from federal service and eventually prosecuted for misuse of government resources, though he would serve less than 2 years in minimum security prison. The counterfeiting ring he had helped orchestrate would be exposed as an unauthorized operation that had crossed numerous legal and ethical lines. Vincent and Marco would never return to Chicago, but their story would become legend in the city's underworld, a reminder that, even in a business built on betrayal and violence, some bonds could not be broken by money, threats, or the manipulations of those who claimed to represent justice. The speakeasy on the south side would eventually become a legitimate restaurant, its back room converted into a dining area where families shared Sunday dinners. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howled through the alleys, old-timers claimed they could still hear the ghost of Vincent Torino's laughter echoing through the walls, along with the clink of glasses raised in toasts to friendship, loyalty, and the kind of honor that money could never buy.